a special vlog for you today because today I want to talk about Irish yarn and Irish mills. Now do bear in mind, as I'm talking through this, I'm talking as a designer and as a knitter, and while I do have some knowledge of how yarn is put together, I am by no means an expert. So it is my knowledge of the mills and of the yarns, what they're like to work with, the advantages, the disadvantages. So it's coming from my own perspective, primarily as a knitter, realistically, what they're like, what's the strong points, what kind of things they don't work so well for, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, I'll begin with the whole thing with my journey, and my journey actually started quite a few years ago. It was back about 2010, maybe it may have been 2009, and I got asked by an editor from a UK magazine to do a feature on Irish yarn, on Kerry Woollen mills. I had a tendency of just saying, yeah, sure, I'll do that for you, but you have to bear in mind that at the time I knew nothing about how yarn was made, nothing about mills. I was completely green. So I came into this as a novice, and I actually think that was an advantage because it meant that I got to go in and ask all of the stupid questions that if I had a lot of foreknowledge I wouldn't have been asking. I would just have been making assumptions, or I wouldn't have wanted to look like I didn't know what I was talking about. But I really did not have a lot of working knowledge, so I was like, educate me. And the process really opened the doors to me and started me on my journey looking at Irish yarns and specifically Irish mills, what they were doing, how they changed over the years, and where they were heading in, really. And so it's still fascinating to me. And when I'm doing tours and retreats and classes here, I spend a lot of time talking about it and about how the whole thing has been impacted by our economy and our history, and how the whole thing is intertwined together in this little mesh. So when I began that story with the Kerry Woollen mills, I realized that the Irish yarn industry, the mills, had really been kind of dropping down in production, because it would have been back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it would really have been the heyday because everyone was hand knitting. Yarns were in big shops, they were easy to access, they were, wool was really, really, I'm going to say popular, but more so than popular, really, it was a necessity. As clothes started becoming mass produced and that started coming into Ireland, which I think probably would have been proper the 70s, even before definitely by the 80s obviously, but by the 70s it really had started to kind of to become a thing in Ireland that was not there before, and people had no interest in knitting, and in fact anyone who did knit tended to veer towards acrylic yarns, like to the extent that wool and yarn have become synonymous in Ireland. If someone comes in and asks, have you got any wool for baby knitting or a particular project, they actually mean yarn. And when you say, here's some wool, they go, no, I don't mean that. And what they actually mean is acrylic. So the meaning of the word wool here has become changed over the years, and it's just become a default for yarn. So what I started thinking about when I did that very first introduction to the Kerry Woollen mills is what was happening in the Irish mills, and the fact that a lot of them hadn't been producing new yarns, or not new yarns, new patterns for the yarn that they had. And it was kind of, the industry was kind of starting to slow down, and kind of tied in with that was the fact that Irish farmers here, they were farming sheep and lambs for their meat, not for the fleece, because they were getting so little for the actual fleece itself. So it ended up becoming this kind of downward spiral, and I kind of decided to inject myself into the middle of that by doing a book where, let me find it here. This was the first book I wrote. It was Contemporary Irish Knits. And this book, the idea behind it was to take a look at the mills in Ireland, to just fly on the wall, walk around, interview them, take photographs, see what they were, get a feel and a flavour for them, and then take the wools that they were producing, each of them being quite different, and showcasing them in new designs. Now, the designs that I put into this, I wanted to somehow blend what I liked to design, which is more contemporary styles, seamless, often top down, not always. Cables work a little bit better bottom up, but that's another story. But it's seamless with some shaping, but also to incorporate some of the really beautiful, rich stitch patterns and cable patterns that had become associated with Ireland. So that's where the name came from, Contemporary Irish Knits, the idea of taking what would traditionally be known as Irish knits and blending them into with a much more contemporary feel, with shapes that people wanted to wear and designed seamlessly, so in kind of the way that I like to design. So that's where that kind of came from. But the backbone of it was the Irish yarn. Like more recently, any of you who've actually been following along for the last couple of months will know that we've taken this one step further as well with our Galway Blanket Project, because the mills produce a mixture of yarns that some of them are from fleece that is imported, others will have a blend of Irish and imported fleeces used in the yarn that they're making. But there isn't any that's doing 100% Irish yarn. And that's why I got really excited about the Galway project and the possibility of what could actually be done with that. Because you were taking something that was basically viewed as a waste product by farmers and giving it a value again. But a value by taking and ring fencing the Galway sheep and saying this is a heritage sheep breed. It is the last native Irish breed that we have. They've been working towards getting a heritage status for it, and pulling that all together with the Galway Wool Co-op, so that they actually had farmers dedicated to breeding specifically the Galway sheep, and then by pulling it into an actual co-op that was working very hard to keeping that fleece as that fleece rather than having it mixed in with other fleeces, so it could keep its actual Galway heritage or integrity, but then finding a way to get it out to the market. Because there's no point them saying we've got this good price for this fleece, because Donegal Yarns took the fleece and they're spinning it and they bought the actual clip. But if there's not a market in the other end, it's not going to go anywhere, because that's kind of where it's going to end up. It'll just stop dead there. It becomes a goodwill project where people get started and thinking this is a really good idea, but unless people take it out and start using it and continue to use it, it's not going to be a self-sustaining thing. So this, the Galway project, we're taking this wool, here we are here, this particular one, and we are acknowledging its positives and its negatives. The positive is that it is a heritage yarn that is a gorgeous colour and is lovely to knit with, gives a very good stitch definition. It's not going to be the softest yarn you ever pick up, because Irish wool in general isn't going to be, it's not a very hospitable climate, so the sheep are going to be a little bit more durable. But it's not uncomfortable to knit with. It's just, if you're very, very sensitive to wool, it's probably going to be rougher than you want. But then taking the fact that that's what it is, and that it does have good stitch definition, particularly with cables, and figuring out what can we work with it. And that's where the blanket came in, is that something like a blanket, it is really showing off the fact that the cables look great in it, the wool looks gorgeous in it, but because it's going to be layered on top of other things, it's totally functional. The best thing about more rustic wool is you are talking durability. This project, like a blanket with something like that, by the time you come out in 10, 20, 30 years time, even 50 years time, it should look just as well. You've got, you're coming out on the positive end and the trade-off between softness and durability. So that's why I got involved in this project. I just love the enthusiasm of everyone involved, and the fact that it's a really good thing on so many levels. And of course, we also got to contribute to the Jigsaw Youth Mental Health Charity, which it's a fantastic charity, because that's another whole story. Youth and mental health in general in Ireland is very poorly funded, so very often charities end up picking up the slack, particularly in relation to youth. there's not much leeway. If something goes wrong, it can go very wrong. But early intervention can actually mean that something that is skewing in the wrong direction can actually be corrected, and it may require, people then may require minimal intervention further in life. So I'm a big believer in early intervention and small tweaks to try and get things on the right path. So I think that the Jigsaw Youth Mental Health is a charity that's very, very well worth supporting. So that's why we ended up picking that one. So this is a big, big circle talking about the different wools and talking about Galway wool, but I'm going to maybe give you a little bit of a small tour of the different mills in Ireland, because that's what's in this book. And I've got over here stacks and stacks of all of the different garments that I produce with that. So I might just give you a very quick tour around. If you want something more in detail, the book is probably where you want to go, but this might give you kind of an overview of what they produce and how they produce it. So in Ireland, we've got 3 working mills that are producing yarn for hand knits. There are other mills, but they're producing the yarn for other purposes, but this is specifically looking at yarn for hand knits. The 3 of them are, we've got Kerry Woollen Mills, Cushendale. Kerry is in Kerry, just outside Kilkenny. No, sorry, Killarney, I beg your pardon. Cushendale is in Kilkenny in a town called Gregnamana, and the 3rd one is Donegal Yarns, which is up in Donegal, so in the northwest of the country. They're all really different, and they produce different kinds of yarn, and so what you do with those yarns are going to be a little different. The first one was Kerry, because that of course was where I started with, and it's the physically closest to me. That one is a smaller mill. It's been one that's been in the family for several generations, and usually with ones like that have gone through several generations, the working machinery in there is going to be a little bit older. Very obviously still functions very well, but it's going to be slightly older machinery that's been handed down through the generations and updated as needed. The yarns that are produced, the type of spinning that is done there, and actually this is the same for all 3 mills, it's a woolen spun. So what woolen spun is, it's got, when it's being carded, it's not all smoothed down in one direction. So you've got the fibers are a little bit higgledy-piggledy, they're not totally flat. So when it's spun, it traps some air in it. So this has got both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is when you have air trapped in your yarn, it makes it very light. Light yarn is really good for when you're going ahead and doing things like cables with it, because cables make the yarn, or make the garment of what you're knitting heavier and denser. If there's air trapped in it, it makes it lighter. So for the same distance or yardage, you will have less weight. So it goes a little bit further, makes it a little bit lighter. So it's very, very good for heavy textures, heavy cables, things like that. Downside is, because it's not smooth, you're not going to get a totally smooth stitch definition. So if you're looking for something very slick, very smooth, with a really, really sharp, crisp definition and crisp stitches, Irish yarns and woolen spun yarns aren't going to give that to you, because by their very nature, when you hold them up, they've just got a little bit of fuzz in them. But if what you're looking for is something that's a little soft around the edges, blooms nicely, is forgiving when you do cables and things like that with it, then it's really good. But don't try to force it into something that it's not. If you're looking for a very, very smooth, tailored kind of finished piece, then woolen spun wouldn't be what you're looking for. But the reason is that tends to be more traditional machinery. The woolen spun would be older machinery. It's what works well within the machines there in Ireland. So the Kerry Woollen Mills, the blend of yarns that or fleeces they would use is, they use a little bit of Irish and a little bit of imported. They don't have a kind of a set amount of each. If there is Irish available and it's a good enough quality or soft enough, they will use that. But it's usually kind of a blend of the two with a little bit of Irish in the mix. Woolen spun, the way it's dyed is, some of it is dyed, let me find it here, after the fact. So like something like this, see, it's a solid color. And this was dyed after the fact, so it's going to be completely solid. Other times you have the fleeces before they're spun dyed up. Then the different colours are blended together and you get something like this, where you get a heathered effect. And the heathered effect gives, I love the heathered effect. I love the fact that when you look at the colours in a heathered or a tweed yarn, there's like about 10 different colours you can pick out in it. It's not going to go with everything. Sometimes what you want is a solid colour, but for the kind of things that are in contemporary Irish knits, the heathered effect works really well. But that's done by the fleeces being dyed first of all, and then it's over dyed. Sorry, the fleeces being dyed first of all, and then they're blended and they're spun afterwards. So you have small little bit of each of those colours that went in the fleeces that are kind of holding its own colour, so to speak, before they get mixed in. So it's, yeah, it keeps little specks of those independent colours, but overall it blends into a different one. The yarn weights they have, the main one they have is an Aran weight, and you will see a lot of the Aran weight here in Ireland. It's kind of, it's almost, it's definitely heavier than a worsted. It would be a heavy worsted, and usually you're looking at about 18 stitches for every 4 inches or 10 centimeters would be what traditionally I would think of as an Aran weight. Generally speaking, using a 5mm needle, sometimes people will drop down to a 4.5 for a tighter effect if you wanted a more dense fabric. But 5mm is probably going to be, I think that's a US 8, will be more typical. The kind of ones, let me have a look at here. When I was doing cables with this particular one is a good example of a cable motif where you've got kind of, the cable is creating the actual hearts. The increases at the top here are start the cable, and then you crisscross it down here, and then all of the decreases finish it off. So it's a closed loop cable that you can use to create a cable motif. This is a much simpler one here. This is the Carsivine vest. This is just a staghorn cable, which is a really simple cable. But I did something a little different. I got rid of the reverse stockinette stitch on each side, which means that the cable creates almost a texture effect and blends into the background rather than really popping out from the background itself. Because if you had reverse stockinette stitch down either here or across the full thing, cable is going to pop straight out really much more dramatically. So this gives it a much more subtle blend, so to speak. So that would be an example of it in textured. So that's the first one, that's our Kerry Woollen mills. The next mill is Cushendale, and that one is a little different again. It's also in a family for several generations, but this time with the kind of yarns they produce is a lighter weight. When it's sold in the US, it's sold as a worsted weight, and over here it's sold as a DK, but it's kind of a heavy DK veering into kind of a lighter US worsted weight, and they also do a sports weight. They only dye the fleece first and then mix it. So it means that the yarns they produce are much tweedier. They try to keep it at about 50% Irish fleece with this particular yarn that they produce. So it means that it's a little bit rougher, but it does soften up really nicely with it. But the DK, because it's a little unusual than producing that weight here, there's a bit more you can do with it, that it's a lighter weight. I can find that you can get a little bit more subtlety with your stitch definition. Let me dig one out here. This is another child sweater, and this one is it is a tweedy effect, but it's very subtle. So it's blue, but there's little bits of white, and I'm kind of looking in. It's very, very subtly tweedy effect, but it's not a solid color. With this, I actually dropped down the needle size, and I did the opposite of the other kids' sweater, Carsivine. And what I've done is I've done all of the background in reverse stockinette stitch, as well as tighten up the needle gauge. And what the two of those combined do is, you can see it really, really makes those cables pop out. They jump straight out at you. And you do lose something when you try to do that because it makes a stiffer fabric. So it's often better used in things like hats or something where you want a dense fabric because it's going to be warm, and you don't mind that it's a little bit stiffer because it's being worn on your head as opposed to kind of around your body. But it's just a good example of different gauges and different backgrounds for your cables could create really different end effects. So this, yeah, that's one from in a DK weight from Cushendale Mills. This is not cables, but it's actually, I put this into the book originally because we've also got a history of tweed here and kind of tartan and pattern and things that are woven blanket wise. So what I actually did with this is I used a slip stitch pattern to create what I think looks very much like a tweed across here. And when close up, you can actually see with this one that the pinks or light purples, I suppose, have got flecks of a load of different colors, but the much darker purple up here have got almost the inverse. So the really nice thing about having a tweedy yarn that comes from a lot of the same pool of fleeces is that when you're using it for color work or things where you're combining two colors, there's going to be a lot of echoes of one over the other, so that when you're looking at them all in together, you get a very cohesive or blended effect as you're putting them together. So that's, yeah, a little tweedy one here. I'm gonna pull this down here. I've got too much stuff floating around. Here is a blanket. This is a baby blanket, small shawl. It was designed as a baby blanket and it's worked. This one is the Cushendale and it's a sports weight. So it starts from the middle out using just cables as the center of each of those increase sets. And it finishes out using old-fashioned kind of feather and fan lace, but with the cable running up the middle. But it's lighter weight, so it can do that. And it's, again, this is one of those tweedy yarns that the colors in this are just fantastic. Like as you go in closer, it's a bit like taking a pixelated photo and it breaks it down into the constituent colors, and it becomes it really starts jumping out at you how many different colors have been blended together to create that tweed effect. So those are a couple of the Cushendale ones, which are all slightly lighter weight, lovely and tweedy, but a little bit stiffer because of the higher portion of the Irish fleece that's been blended in. The third mill we're going to look at is quite different from the other two. This is Donegal Yarns. That one was in the 1970s, I believe. I could be wrong on the actual timeline, but it is more recent that this was set up, and it was set up by the government originally to create employment in the area, because Donegal would traditionally have been an area where there would been a lot of emigration from there, and so they were trying to bring industries in there to keep employment in the area. But what that means is, because it wasn't one that was passed down from generation to generation and was actually custom built as a mill, it was much larger and it was much more industrial with large, more modern equipment built into it. That actually means that it's set up quite differently from the rest, because it doesn't sell directly to the public, it just sells wholesale. So it'll sell to, there's another company nearby called Studio Donegal that would sell it around to yarn shops. It would sell into a lot of big yarn producers that are looking for Donegal style yarn or Irish yarn in general, because it had a bigger facility and it can produce on a much larger scale. That also has a second implication though, because the Irish fleece isn't mass produced here, and most of it ends up in waste from farmers. There's no scarring facilities. There's no way for us to take large amounts of high quality wool and actually get it processed as Irish wool. Anything that is produced here, it's not divided down, except for Galway Wool, which is why Galway is co-op is a little different. Generally, it's put into a big pot. It will be graded, it's sent over to the UK to be scoured, and then it comes back to mills over here. So it also means that the Irishness, or the fact that it being Irish fleece, isn't always preserved. It is more likely to get blended in with other fleeces along through the process as well. And so it means that because there's not going to be a very regular supply of it, for a mill that is producing on a much larger scale, they can't really rely on that until there's a good production line of Irish wool at a high quality coming through. So Donegal, for the yarn lines that they're better known for, their fleeces are all imported. They are starting to move more in the direction of some other yarns that they're doing. Oh, where did I put it? I have, here we go, of other yarns that they're doing that have got different kinds of blends of fleeces. The reason I was looking for our Blasta, because that's kind of part of the whole story. So the first one I'm wearing here, this is Killy Beggs, and it's actually one of my favorite from the book. But what this uses is one of the yarns that they became best known for. This is just their Aran Tweed, and it's a single ply, and it's created to look like a homespun. So it's got single ply, thick and thin, with lots and lots of tweed flecks running through it. But unlike the other ones where the tweed flecks are a little accidental, because normally you have all of these different color fleeces, they're put in together, they're mixed up, and then they're blended to create a yarn where you'll have flecks of tweed. This goes one step further, and it actually picks out different little colors of neps that you want to have these bright flecks of color. They're blended up, basically created like little felted balls. Then they are mixed in with the actual mixing process for the fleece before it goes to be spun. And because they are kind of created almost as little balls, when they go through, they preserve the integrity of their color, and they come out like little flecks. The reason they started doing that was to mimic what actually happened in the homespun at home. So you have thick and thin, because if you're spinning yourself, it's not going to be very cohesive. And the flecks came from the fact that you didn't want to waste different bits of yarn. So you would end up just pulling, if there was a little left over for something else, it would go into the spinning process. So you'd always have these little flecks of different colors running through. And it was actually really nice up in Donegal Yarns to see that that's actually built into part of the process, is that the waste from the other yarn is taken and it's actually incorporated in to create these flecks, as that's where a lot of them come from, is in fact from the waste process of creating the other yarn. So it makes it a really, really sustainable way of creating yarns, because there's very little waste, and everything that looks like it should be waste gets incorporated back into the process and actually enhances the end product and creates something totally unique. So that they're single ply. The one that we actually have in the shop here is, this one is Studio Donegal is the one that sells these, but this is their soft Donegal, and this one takes a merino yarn. So merino yarn would normally, you think of it as very soft, which it still is obviously, but most of the time you see it and it is worsted spun, very smooth, very slick, and has got a very, very different feel. But if you take something like a fine yarn, a fine fleece like merino, and you use a woolen spun process, I kind of think you end up pulling in the best of both worlds, because you've got the soft merino, but the airy woolen spun process makes it a little less refined, a little rougher around the edges. So you've got something that's lighter, less sharp and crisp, but just look at you still get all those lovely tweedy effects into it. So this one is the Aran weight, and this is the chunkier weight. So it's very, it just brings in the best of both worlds, is the best way to put it. This is our own Blasta that they spun for us, and this is the beginning of something new that Donegal Yarns have been working towards. I suppose enhancing it and moving more into a more sustainable and Irish-based economy, because this takes 60% Irish fleece and there's 40% imported fleece. But it's soft enough to work with, not super, super soft, but particularly once it's washed, I find it very pleasant to wear. And I am fussy enough. Like, I'm not crazy sensitive, but I definitely am not into like very, very rough. So it does that by carefully grading the fleece that comes in. So when they're taking it in, they're actually, for this, just taking the softest grade of the Irish fleece and mixing it with the 40% imported. So it means that you get a softer yarn than you normally would with Irish fleeces. This one here is taking 2 plies of that, and it's creating a DK, or like a light worsted weight would be what the Blasta is. Our Blasta Light is a much thinner, finer one, and it's a singles yarn. It can be a bit delicate because of the fact that woolen spun singles doesn't have as much integrity to it, so it can be pulled apart more easily. It still, once it's finished, it works very well, holds together okay, but you kind of have to be careful when you're working with it because it could be pulled apart. We have been doing a few things lately whereby, like the Iskra sweater, we've held it with a mohair strand, and that means that obviously it has the lovely mohair that you produce with it, but it also gives it a bit more integrity. So being able to combine two different properties like that means that you can kind of create, it's like custom making your own yarn when you've got very fine ones that you blend together. But some of the other bits here, this is another one you can kind of see in terms of the tweed. This is a hat version of the Killy bags, and you can see how it has created all of those little flecks going through. Here is another one. This is actually one of my favorites from the book, but this is a lovely teal color, but there's really bright specks of orange and blue and purple running through this, so that it's got so many different colors and something that looks like a solid yarn. So yeah, that is a kind of a very quick overview of my designer, knitter understanding of the yarns, why I pick certain yarns, what I think is nice about them, where they don't necessarily work for all projects, but the kind of projects that I think a lot of them do work well with is cables, anything that you want to make a bit lighter, if you want a bit more durability and you want it to last for a long time because you've got just a more substantial yarn to work with. They all work really well in those kind of situations. But I want to become a part of preserving what is happening in Ireland in yarn, reinvigorating the whole I'm trying to figure out the word, yarn process, the yarn journey all the way through, and helping support people like the Galway Wool Co-op that are really an integral part of that, because it has to start from the bottom up. That having someone fight for a good price for the fleece, and then if I can take that and I can explain the benefits of it for knitters and why you want to use it, it can make this sustainable. It can make something that can keep living on and keep growing as people really start to appreciate, understand why you want to knit with it, understand the importance of it, and the fact that by supporting this, you support the farmers that are producing it very directly. It means that when they're supported, they've got more reason to produce Irish yarn and keep improving the quality, so they can breed for softness of their fleece as much as for the quality of anything else. That becomes as important a characteristic. Which wasn't the case up to the last couple of years, and so if they're part of this journey, we can keep improving the fleece and the yarn and the wool that comes from our Irish sheep by actually saying to farmers and to the mills, we want this, we want to knit with this, we want to see this succeed, and we want to see this improve. So I invite you in on this journey with me to actually become part of this process. So if you want to keep hearing more about this, come jump in on our yarn journey on things like Celtic Knits, our blog, on Knit Hub, and just, yes, help us support this whole industry from the bottom up. Come along next week to hear me see if I find another yarn or something else to rant and talk to you all about. But yeah, it's fun. It's fun to be part of something bigger than yourself, that's for sure.